So the only one you don't have is mine, which is okay, because hopefully I'm plugged in, although I can't see it, so it's a bit hard to tell. I am, and I tried to make it go up on that screen, but it didn't work. Yeah, that would be kind of useful. I tried F5 duplicate output, didn't. They must be controlling it because it's their slide on it. Do you want to go in the middle, Mike? Sure. Command from the side.
We'll get started in just a second. Just trying to do the final. Oh, we're good. Was that your computer?
Nope. Nope. Aha. Excellent.
Eric here. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Mike Finley. I'm a political scientist at Brigham Young University and a principal investigator on the AID Data Project. This panel is entitled the Panel on Visualizations for AID Transparency and Management. The goal of this panel is really to try to discuss a little bit more what strategies are being undertaken right now to deal with the deluge of information out there that's just really coming on the stage faster than we can deal with it. And so we'll discuss ways that the AID information is becoming more comprehensible, easier to process for a very wide range of users, and some of the challenges that go along with that process, as well as some trends and opportunities for future development there. So. Just to introduce our panelists briefly, we'll have Karin Christensen will speak to us first. And the way we're going to do this is kind of the pattern that we've had all morning, which is each of the panelists will spend about 4 to 5 minutes, introduce some ideas, and then from there we'll take questions and hopefully move to a discussion as quickly as possible. So Karin Christensen is the director of Publish What You Fund. Prior to setting up Publish What You Fund, she was the policy manager at the One campaign, and for 6 years she was a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. So her policy and research specialisms include aid, donor behavior, aid effectiveness, and reform from a recipient perspective. Second speaker will be John Hecklinger from Global Giving. He's really led their efforts in Global Giving to be able to get grassroots information, grassroots opinions, information, stories from social entrepreneurs and NGO directors in a wide variety of places. We'll then have Stephen Ansari say a few words. Stephen Ansari's been with a company called Blue Raster for about 13 years. Has been doing a variety of different things to try to turn data into various tools and visualizations. And then following Stephen, we'll have Eric Gunderson talk for a little bit. Eric's from Development Seed. He's the co-founder and president, and he helps run project strategy and product development. Speaks widely on a variety of topics ranging from open data, open source software, and so forth. Some of the things that are, I think, of great interest to this panel. And then at that point, I'll say a few concluding remarks, and then we'll turn it over to some discussion. So without further ado, then. Karin?
Sorry, I'm, as ever, still slightly struggling with the technology. Okay, so what I wanted to just talk through today, I'm actually going to stand up. I always find it slightly disconcerting sitting down with these things, was a little bit about the aspiration of what we wanted to do in aid visualization and aid information management. Oh, sorry, okay. Is that actually on? Yes, it is. And then talk a bit about the reality of where we actually are, and and how we got there and what the problems are, and as a consequence, what we're doing about those problems. So, you know, from kind of theory to attempts at practice, I guess. So I'm going to try and do the live version of this, actually, because it's more interesting, and all that making those bubbles move took time, so it's more fun if we can. So this is kind of the end game to some extent. This is what we think it would be really cool to be able to do. No. Right, so this isn't working because the slides aren't showing up on the... Okay, I'll just do it from the PowerPoint.
I think you need to speak a little more directly.
Yeah. So what we wanted, this is actually a live version. I wanted people to be able to see the live version, but you could actually see aid and budget data together. Get it up on a website, allow people to be able to explore it, look at each of the bubbles. You know, that's health, but we've got public administration, public sector management, etc. Be able to actually click down onto those bubbles, that's education. You can see aid spending, that's budget support, domestic spending, aid projects, be able to click onto each of those colours, see how much donors are spending in each one, actually get down to the detail of the data of what each of these projects are, both government and donor, and have a really interesting conversation then that starts about, is this the best way to spend money? Is there better ways to spend money? Tend to put security up there. Everybody wants to see security budgets. So there's, you know, the ability to do all that. But the main problem is that that is not currently possible. Took 6 months. I mean, this graph, the big divergence is between how much more data we had to collect. And the real thing is it took us 6 months. Am I going the right way? No, that's not making sense. It took, to get that data set that you've just seen there, took a 5-person research team nearly 6 months to collect. And then it's taken a bit of time to map, then it took a bit of time to map it to the Ugandan budget. That data at least was available. We had full Ugandan Ministry of Finance backing to actually extract that information from donors. And that graph you saw before was the difference between what the Ugandan government thought was in the country. So that, on the big divergence is the 2006 data to look at. And what was actually coming into the country and what we managed to correct. So the GOU MTEF is what the government knew about. This is the pink one is what the donors economist group knew about. And actually, the FDT data was what was actually flowing into the country in that year. So it was 50% more projects. And it took £250,000 to get that data set. And full World Bank and DFID, so some of the 2 largest agencies in the world and the largest agencies in Uganda's backing to extract that information. I keep pressing the wrong direction. And then we had to do the data processing and build the data model and the visualization and flatten a whole series of incredibly complicated data sets. The other problem was it was designed in Access, which one rapidly learns never to do again. And then turning something that was a lot in, you know, Flash tends to be used, turning it into Java, JavaScript, so actually it can be used on everybody's computers rather than just some people's and that kind of thing. But this bit took us a couple of, probably a total of 3 man-woman weeks. The other stuff was the difficult and expensive stuff. And that is just simply ridiculous. This information is available in pretty much every donor's system on the planet. Not all of it, but most of the information we're talking about is already held in accounting system, project management systems. And that's just not good enough that we're not being able to produce those kind of visualizations relatively easily. So what did we decide to do about it? Well, as a consequence, there is now a campaign to try and get this data released. Now, with a bit of luck, I can make this play, but not completely lost my mouse on this now. Here we are. I hate technology. Don't mean that, by the way. I think sometimes. Is anybody seeing any of this, actually?
Mm-hmm. It was there until
it was there, but we've lost it. Is the mouse up there, then? Ooh, okay, let's see if I can get it down. I tried to unextend this. Why is it doing that? Right. So if I drag that up, whee, and then press play, might need some remote guidance. Where's the mouse gone?
It's up the top right.
This is audience participation. So. Ooh, ooh.
Yay!
This better be good now. Okay. No, but I have ways around that. Or not, in case maybe. Right, I'll start again though. I might need some remote guidance again. Where am I? Yeah, I'm trying to. I just need to restart it.
Governments and charities who give aid money need more information. They can't know where best to spend their aid money without knowing what others are doing.
There we go. Awesome.
Aid is a scarce and precious resource. At the moment, governments and charities all over the world fund different projects to help solve important problems for people in developing countries.
Can anybody hear that?
Whether the money comes from people's
Yeah, do it
taxes
right
or
next
straight
door,
from
it was
their
better.
pockets, when spent well, aid makes a real difference. But at the moment, nobody knows where all the money is
Can you
going.
guys increase the volume, please?
Best. Nobody can see the bigger picture. Governments and charities who give aid money need more information. They can't know where best to spend their aid money without knowing what others are doing or planning. If the minister who decides where aid money is spent can't see the bigger picture, then it's hard to make informed
Thank
choices
you.
about where to invest to make the
Okay,
most
I'm now going to
difference.
start again. We've now got the volume
Without this
back.
information, some areas don't get enough funding, and others have too many donors involved. At the same time, while government ministers in developing countries
Right,
know
let's do this properly from the beginning.
aid
Okay.
is a scarce and precious resource. At the moment, governments and charities all over the world fund different projects to help solve important problems for people in developing countries. Whether the money comes from people's taxes or straight from their pockets, when spent well, aid makes a real difference. But at the moment, nobody knows where all the money is going or what's working best. Nobody can see the bigger picture. Governments and charities who give aid money need more information. They can't know where best to spend their aid money without knowing what others are doing or planning. If the minister who decides where aid money is spent can't see the bigger picture, then it's hard to make informed choices about where to invest to make the most difference. Without this information, some areas don't get enough funding, and others have too many donors involved. At the same time, while government ministers in developing countries know how much of their own money they have to fund essential services like health and education, they don't know how much aid money is going to be spent in their country and on what. Without access to up-to-date information on aid, they can't see the bigger picture. If good information on aid isn't accessible to the public as well, it's impossible for citizens to see whether the aid money their country is giving or receiving is going to the places, people, and problems it should be. They have a right to know. If the government knows where the aid money coming into the country is going to be spent, they can make sure their own money is properly targeted. Since a meeting in Accra, Ghana in 2008, aid donors have been working hard to try to make their aid more transparent. They've developed a way to share all relevant information in a common format, so that it will be easier to understand, compare, and use. When everyone can access this information, then people can make more informed choices about where money is needed most and where it will have the biggest impact. Taxpayers, people who give money to charities, and people living in developing countries will hold their leaders accountable for the promises they've made and know their money is being spent well. Now we need to get as many donors as possible to share their information so that aid, a scarce and precious resource, can be used most effectively. New technology is allowing citizens around the world to demand transparency and make sure money gets where it's meant to. We need your help too. So what can you do? Tell your government to publish their aid information in line with the international standard so that everyone can see the bigger picture.
Okay, so I hope everybody will. So out of, in some ways, pure frustration, we've ended up launching a campaign called Make Aid Transparent to get this information out. Let me see if I can get back to the PowerPoint. I'm just going to add an extra word on comparability, which I know that people in this room will get. We had a lot of tensions at the beginning of Publish What You Fund as to whether you go for more information or better information. And of course there's a mix on this stuff. It's not, either or, but it was interesting that the aid experts, the people that had been working in aid, wanted better as a starting point. So the International Aid Transparency Standard, which took a good couple of years of negotiation, was launched in February. Like all data standards, it's going to take time to evolve and get there, but we should have 33% of aid flows covered. But it's a hard sell, data standards on a campaigning platform, because it sounds so deeply boring. But, and my metaphor tends to be, it's only when you leave the United States with your American plug and try and plug it into a British or a European plug that you realize there's no standard in plugs. So good standards you don't actually notice. The point of what we're trying to achieve, so that I think what a number of the things that the other panelists can talk about can become automated and quick, and we can move away from having conversations about what's going on to why and how and who and how could it be done better. The starting point for that is just when you publish data, Uganda is Uganda is Uganda, rather than that being 6 months of painful plotting together. So that's what we've got to, and my ask for everybody in this room is, one, will you sign up, please, to the Make Aid Transparent campaign? And then we've got a particular challenge in the US because it's multiple agencies, so help us and help the number of US agencies that are very committed to this, to actually try and get some of this done, because a lot of that is about demonstrations of public demand and support, and people like you actually committing to making this stuff happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. John, go ahead.
Sure, and I think what I'm about to talk about has a direct link with what Karen is talking about as well. And what we're trying to do is answer a couple of key questions. One of the things that's been missing from this set of data that we're all trying to wrestle with is, what people in the communities that ultimately are having development done to them, what do they actually think? What are they seeing? Everyone knows that in these communities, you go to the developing world, they know which organizations are at the bar every night, which organizations are stellar, which organizations are lazy. And if you live there for a little while, you kind of get a feel for that. So what we're trying to do is try to collect a lot of that information quickly and then make it useful. So we can add another dimension to the information that we're all trying to track about what's happening in the world. The hope is that recognizing that the development system is complex. It's not simple, it's not complicated, it's complex. It's not a puzzle that you can solve by applying enough controls and enough experts and enough rules around what's going to happen, because you simply can't predict the ultimate outcome of any intervention you're trying. If you try the same thing over and over again, chances are you'll get different results every time. So what we feel is really potentially useful is some sort of real-time feedback mechanism to allow everyone in the process to make more kind of real-time adjustments, from the people on the ground who actually might be able to demand more appropriate things for their community, to the local NGOs who are actually doing the service development, service delivery, to folks who are controlling large amounts of aid flow. If you know what people are actually thinking, and we can get that information to people at the right time in the right way, then we think that's a good contribution. It also happens to be extremely useful for global giving in particular. We have a network of 1,500 or so NGOs, mostly in the developing world, who use the global giving platform essentially to raise money and connect with supporters. And we're really good at measuring the outputs. I mean, we've seen over $50 million of flow from 216,000 donors to over 4,500 specific projects. So what? What does that actually mean? Are the organizations we're working with somehow more effective than others? One of the things we believe we can do to learn more about that is by actually asking people in communities. So what we've done is, and yeah, let's go to the next slide, Karin, if you wouldn't mind.
They're controlling.
Oh, they are. Thank you. Okay. So what we've done in East Africa is launched what we call the Global Giving Storytelling Project. And we developed this methodology in connection with a guy named Dave Snowden, who runs a company called Cognitive Edge, and using his SenseMaker software. We developed a standard framework for capturing beneficiary feedback. We ask an open-ended question. We're not asking, what do you think about this school in your neighborhood? People say, it's great, don't take it away. We say, please tell us a story about a time when a person or organization tried to help someone or change something in your community. Very open-ended. It can end up being a story about the government, about a person, about an organization. It could be an organization associated with global giving or not. And then we ask a series of questions about the story that this individual just told. So we get a nice combination of pure qualitative storytelling and data, which you can then use to create visualizations. What are people saying? How are people tagging their own stories about a particular issue in a particular place? How are men tagging their stories differently from women? What are their stories about? How are the stories changing in content over time? So this is just a copy of the framework that we're using. You can see it has everything from, give your story a title, what does your story describe? Is it a need? Is it a problem? Is it a solution? Did it benefit nobody? Did it benefit the right people or the wrong people? What is your connection to the story? And then some demographic information. Who are you? How old are you? Where exactly do you live? What's your mobile number, so we can feed back stories to you and communicate with you in various ways to follow up. And then we have an optional question, because we work through many partners on the ground who are actually executing this for us, and sometimes they have specific things they would like to ask. We've collected over 21,000 of these short narratives in East Africa, and we're starting to see spontaneous adoption of this within the Global Giving Network. The cool thing is that we're not just learning about global giving, we're learning about all kinds of organizations that we didn't know about, that people are telling positive and negative stories about. So this data set is potentially useful to the sector at large. And now we're in the, let's go one forward. We've made all of the stories searchable on Global Giving. You can see that column to the right. There are 10 randomly selected stories that pop up. We've got some basic mapping where you can look at them and figure out where exactly they are. There's a basic search, so if you're interested in a particular issue. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an example of a story that's told. This one came up in a random search. You can see it's raw, unfiltered, and real. It names an organization. It's a tough issue. In isolation, this story makes a nice anecdote. When you look at a pattern around this organization called FIDA, we've got 50 or so stories that are all sort of saying the same thing about this organization. That's a positive thing. That means, wow, global giving is not working with this organization. Maybe we should. People are spontaneously talking about them. We should probably look at adding them to our network because all of these stories are extremely, extremely positive. This is not a methodology that helps global giving determine that we've reduced poverty by 3% in East Africa, but it's a way that helps us manage our marketplace going forward, and we believe will be useful to the sector more broadly. Let's go forward one more. This is a relatively ugly snapshot. I'm sure you've seen a lot prettier visualizations today. But every dot on this triangle represents a story. So when you go into the piece of software we're using called SenseMaker, you can look at how these stories group together circle them and pull them out. So you can isolate for what men are saying about a specific issue in a specific place, look at the groupings and pull out the stories. So what this allows you to do is sort of get inside, the stories that a community is telling each other about a variety of things without actually having to know what you're looking for in the first place. So to make this really useful for everyone, from the beneficiaries themselves to the organizations that work with global giving, to global giving, and to the sector at large, we're working with Development Gateway to plug all the stories into AData AMP. We're hoping to make sure that this information ties into potentially a substandard with IATI, so that if others are gathering beneficiary stories and narratives around the world, it can be tied together more easily. And frankly, we're looking for people to help us make sense of all this information that we're gathering. We're finding it useful, but we're taking a very open source approach. So if others have an interest in doing work on this and figuring out what's in there, we're really open to it.
Great, thanks, John. Stephen, you want to go next?
Hello. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle. You've seen a lot of visualizations today, and where I'm going to go is talking about how do you deal with the amount of data to be able to produce those kinds of visualizations. One of the things we found is that the Fort Knox appearance might be because of technical capacity. And I'm going to share a story about two countries, Moldova and Kenya, who historically have not been very open about their data. But after conversations over the course of a year, we learned that it was really about technical capacity and not at all political resistance. At the World Bank, they have the Boost initiative, and this initiative has helped bring some of that technical capacity in country so that they can share this data. And what happened as a result is that these two countries became very, very transparent. In fact, I'll jump ahead here. On July 7th, Kenya launched its Open Data Initiative, and it's a whole portal dedicated to transparency of nearly every line item in their budget. In Moldova, they have 10 years of in-country budgetary spending. And you can see here on this slide that this is expanding. It's not just Kenya. We've launched one for Peru, and it's moving throughout the world. So with a visualization tool like Boost, we're able to dive into the subnational level and look at spending as it supplements and cooperates with the international aid funding. And so this is a different part of the equation. There's money being spent through typical aid gateways, but then also what is the government itself spending, and how do those two relate? One of the things we found is if you take 10 years of data and of an entire government, it's a lot of information. And on the left-hand side, you'll see what people like. People like Excel. People like plain language text. They like a lot of formatting and color and nested borders so that you can make sense of it. They certainly like the visualizations that you've seen today. But other more subtle things like commas and dollar signs, conventions, accounting conventions, like the use of red ink instead of a minus sign. These are things that are found in data all over the place. And being able to bring that data to visualizations depends on getting beyond these human design parts of the data and moving more into something that machines like. Machines like numeric codes. They don't like text. They don't like formatting. Machines don't like nested headers. They like raw numbers. They certainly don't like commas and all kinds of symbols in the data itself. So on the right, you'll see what the Moldova data looks like after it's been processed for computers. So just to look at the numbers for a minute, in Moldova they have 935 municipalities. And we have budget information for 10 years. And there's nothing on this slide that's important other than to say that there's a lot of data. It's billions of line items. And the old way of doing things just is not possible anymore. When I first started here in DC, I had a colleague who printed every single email he received and put it in a 3-ring binder. This is almost 15 years ago. And the binders started to stack up in his cube. And at some point, he realized that the old way of filing correspondence just is not going to work anymore. And he had to leave it in the inbox. Well, that same thing applies to dealing with billions of records from hundreds of countries, from decades of years. We have to use tools. In this case, I'm showing you a screenshot from Safe Software's FME. This allows us to mechanically create workflows that we can repeat. We can bring from country to country to assist with dealing with you've heard the word deluge 100 times today. It truly is a flood, and we need to use tools and use them intelligently. We also need to make things digestible. People can't consume billions of records. They need tools like Boost to help them filter and pivot and sort and look at their sector, what's important to them. And at the end of the day, people are still likely to take that data, the subset, something that's a handhold, something you can bite off and chew, and bring it into Excel. So we have to be mindful to cover our bases and go back to where people are comfortable, working in Excel, working in desktop software. As you know, more people are interested in this data. It used to be there were academics and researchers and analysts, and then there were a development community. The aid community was really interested in this data, and they got their hands on it, and they're doing great things. But now it's the people, the democratization of data. Everybody wants access to this. And along with that comes more requirements, technical requirements. A lot of countries don't have the capacity to deal with setting up infrastructure and both software and hardware. We're moving from the desktop beyond the server into the cloud. These are things that countries need help learning how to build these things, and they need assistance to increase their capacity. So why is Boost successful? Well, it's because it's very timely. As soon as the data is available from the country, it is up on the website within months instead of years. It's flexible, it's comprehensive, it's effective, and most of all, it's very transparent. These are the raw numbers, and we're able to package them in a digestible way and share it with different organizations and general people. And the last reason why it truly is a success story is because it's spreading. This capacity is being shared from one country to the next, and this map shows the destination that the World Bank is taking in helping bring that capacity in country. And with that, that's it.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Eric?
Yeah, I'd love the plug. Well, thank you. I don't think we need a lot of data visual. Does that look weird up there? I don't think we need a lot of data visualization to actually talk about one of the root problems here. A lot of this is organizational infrastructure and actually being able to have data. I make maps, as Jamie introed, and more importantly, I actually make open source software that allows you to make really custom, fast, and beautiful maps, and that really matters on the communication side. But the reality is, that matters internally because you actually get to look at your data differently with a map, and you get to actually add other external context to your data, because yeah. Hey, is this better? All right, I'll just stay close here. This is the power of what's possible on the mapping side. The reality is this isn't happening. Number one reason, most people don't have good data, and it's embarrassing. Two, there hasn't been a lot of incentives to leverage other external data sets because it's actually really hard to get access to them. Lastly, there's a competency issue in many organizations for people to actually skill up and leverage software. As software is becoming easier to use and open source software is becoming better, this is certainly going to start changing. All right, let me not jump the gun. All of this is going to start changing. Number one, a lot of organizations are now getting to the point where they have to start keeping data in a digital format that's actually more flexible rather than making this stuff to PDFs. Two, you're seeing a lot happening in the open data space, so you can quickly now start leveraging other people's data sources, which then add a lot of value to your own data source. And then lastly, as I just mentioned, you have a huge win here, leveraging new software coming out. And the basic incentives here are that you can start actually making data-driven decisions. It is astonishing how many people are operating with basically blinders on just because they actually don't have their data pulled together. On top of that, it's like actually being I think there are some other incentives to leverage this way outside of your own organization. If you are putting your data together for analysis on a map, well, then you're able to actually share that. Why? Because you actually have data now for the first time. Two, your data is positioned in a digital kind of format that you can release. And three, you can actually release some of the visuals. So other agencies can start coming around and start leveraging this. Next thing you know, your organization is able to empower so many other organizations. Lastly, maps look really good, or good maps look really good. I can't tell you how many $50,000 projects have helped multi-million-dollar programs and have become like the end-use piece. And it's what I really like about making some of these maps look really gorgeous is it's starting to raise a bar and people's expectations that this stuff can be mapped, which is then on a vanity level with higher ups, right? They're like, hey, I want to see the common operating picture. I want to be able to actually look at what's going on. And once they do this for one or two projects, there's actually going to be an expectation that they can do this for any project. And that's going to force a lot of organizational culture to adjust and actually have better data structure. So I'm most interested to get to conversation points and hear what's going on with folks' own maps and data collection processes, though, and kind of talk about some of those specific details. But I think done right, the actual maps have to be used internally. This has to become part of your process iteratively because you don't know how bad your data is until you start trying to visualize it. So the fact that tools start getting easier to use and you can start making this part of your regular operations is huge, where you can literally drill down into data, take a quick spreadsheet. I mean, the map you're looking at here took a little over half a data pull together, and now I'm able to look at microfinance operations all the way down to a district level within Afghanistan, and then quickly get a sense of who's working where in context to security incidents happening, and then be able to click on any point and actually get a trend over time of what's actually happening in a particular district. This totally adds new context. I mean, right? Where's our problems in the country? I can tell you there's no microfinance operations happening there. Here's a project we're working with Mixed Market. They're like Bloomberg for microfinance. They're trying to go into subnational mapping, right? Right now they just have it on a national basis. Well, what do you do? First, they were like, hey, let's take a certain set of data and let's actually try to prototype what subnational work looks like so we can get a better sense of what our data structure is. So here you can see density points showing number of microfinance banks operating on a per state basis. And you quickly see the value of the context data that I was mentioning. You see places like Kano, the most populous state in the country, only having 6 MFIs. You know, you jump down to a place like Lagos here, and you're looking at about 9.1 million. And it's like, wait, just look at the sheer magnitude difference between these two. This is crazy. Like, why is that happening? Is it the fact that there's a Sharia law line here, and that you should be concerned about, and like, there's actually a difference between Muslim banking standards or in the north? Or, hold on, let me pull up a little here. Or, yeah, like bring in these other indicators and start laying it aside alongside your own data to actually see what's going on. Let me just actually stop there. G3 is getting a little slow. But this gives you a sense of like storytelling with maps. This needs to be part of your internal operations. And right now, the reality is a lot of people aren't doing this because they actually don't have their data together, and it's embarrassing. So let me stop there.
Apparently there are 2 desktops here, and we can only see one. Does that work?
If you do view full screen,
Let me get the slideshow now. Got it? Okay, can't see anything up here, but we'll make it work. So, first of all, thanks to everyone. This has been really fascinating to learn, all these different things that are going on, and to see the different types of data that are coming online through EOTI and Publish What You Fund's efforts, and as well as budget data and recipient data and all sorts of things, and the way we can use these maps so much quicker and faster. I'd like to take a step back a little bit and just talk about the reasons why we're using visualizations and going after transparency. I think for me and for probably most of us, we see this as, that visualization is a means to an end, right? And this work? So it's a means to an end, and it helps us answer these important questions that we want to be able to change behavior about, such as how is foreign aid allocated, but perhaps most importantly, is foreign aid effective, right? I mean, if we give aid to countries, whether it be from multilateral donors or bilateral donors or private donors or whoever it may be, we really want to be able to answer that causal question. Is the aid that's flowing effective in some way? Is it reducing poverty? Is it lowering mortality? And so forth. And I think visualization takes us in a direction we want to go. We can begin to learn things from visualization. But I want to raise a few potential pitfalls that we come up against when we use visualizations. And I think that I think we see these when we have visualizations that are maybe too simple, and then maybe visualizations that are too complex. And trying to find kind of the right levels of information to be able to produce and display is crucial. So let me show a few examples and tell a couple of stories here. At AData, we've been working recently in partnership with the World Bank and African Development Bank to geo-reference all of the active projects that they have in country. So this is a map of Ethiopia where we've got both World Bank and African Development Bank projects mapped. And so the green dots here are World Bank, the yellow dots are African Development Bank. And shaded in the background is information about poverty. okay, percent of the population under the poverty line. Hopefully that's all visible. And so we look at a simple map like this and we wonder, okay, what can we learn from a map like this? Does this show that aid is reducing poverty? Okay, if you look at this, most aid projects are going into that kind of medium shade, right, which is kind of medium levels of poverty, which could mean a variety of things, right? I mean, this could mean that it's reducing poverty. It could mean that that it's been allocated to areas that are doing better, right? If indeed that's what we saw in the past. It could mean something quite different too. If we were to map population density onto this, we'd actually find that most of these projects are going to high density locations. Okay, and so it may not have anything at all to do with poverty, right? Whether being allocated there or having a good effect on poverty. But if we looked at the population data closer, we'd also see that in the northernmost part of the country and northeast part, where there's very few projects, there's actually higher population density there as well. And so it's neither being allocated there nor potentially being effective there, okay? Now I'm being highly speculative, but I'm doing this for a reason, and that is to illustrate that we begin to learn things with these visualizations, but there's a lot that we don't learn, and there's a lot that we still need to incorporate somehow. We need to know about what's going on with some of these additional factors in these cases. Here's another one. This is also World Bank and active World Bank projects and active African Development Bank projects. And you see a lot of clustering, right? I mean, just a lot of clustering through this southern corridor, especially southwestern. And if you look at sort of the background, this is again poverty, and shaded in the background. You'll see that nearly all the projects are actually going to what we might call the least needy areas of Kenya. Okay, very few are going to the areas with high poverty. And again, if we wanted to take a population density map, we'd see that the aid is going to these areas of high population density. And maybe that's how it should be, okay? We don't exactly know, how much aid's go. With these visualizations, we don't know exactly how much is going where and how much money each sort of individual is getting. But we need to sort of be able to delve deeper into some of these data to try to understand and learn what's going on. I could continue and we could talk about a bunch of the other things that we learn and don't learn from these data, but this sort of gives us an initial look of what we're beginning to find with some of these data. So a third project with, let's see, we're getting part of this, and I'm not even going to try to mess with it so we can see more of the map. But this is some work with Development Gateway, aid data, and importantly, researchers at the University of Texas at Austin in the CCAPS program. This is a slide that Aleem showed earlier in his talk about where we've, with the cooperation from the Ministry of Finance in Malawi, we're able to geocode all of the projects from all of the donors, all active projects from all of the donors. I believe we now have something in the neighborhood of about 90% of the data for Malawi. And this begins to tell us a little bit more. We begin to see a little bit more that some donors are going to different areas, right? So maybe in Kenya and Ethiopia, areas that are missed, maybe they're being covered by other donors. That's something else we may not learn from the other maps. But there's even things that we don't learn from this as well, right? I mean, these are just locations. We don't know what sectors these projects were designed to target, okay? So we might look at this and say, wow, there's lots of clustering and maybe it appears in the right places, but maybe we need to go even further and see are health projects going to locations where there are health needs or there are effects there, right? I mean, and so there's a lot we don't learn, and there's these other dimensions that we may need to take into account, even with the data that we do have. And so it may sound like I'm making an argument for let's make these maps as complex as possible, which is not what I'm trying to do. But I am trying to suggest that we need to be a little bit careful what we learn, especially if we want to go back to that question I posed at the beginning and answer this causal question. Is aid having an effect? These maps, I think, they help us ask more questions, but they don't resolve it, and we need to move in directions that will help us resolve it. So let me talk about just a few lessons and then a few strategies we might follow here. I apologize, there's a lot of text on this slide. But I just want to raise a few issues. Some of the things that we don't have currently, but that we probably need as soon as possible. We need better information on aid and need over time. From a scientific perspective, if we want to establish some causal relationship between aid and, say, a decrease in poverty, we need to know that the aid actually decreased, or excuse me, the aid occurred or flowed into a country prior to witnessing changes in levels of poverty. Fairly obvious, but the problem is we have all the, everything we have right now is sort of current information on poverty, current information on aid, and we don't necessarily know which came first, okay? Getting some better data on aid over time and getting these stable units of comparison would help. Need connections to other types of information, and the other panelists have already talked about this, so I'm not going to say a whole lot more here, but a lot from donors to government resources to NGOs to citizens. We need to know that information to be able to capture the full universe of aid. And then we need some more sophisticated methods to identify potentially confounding variables and sort of these more complex causal pathways. And so the omitted variables in those early graphs, population density, whatever that may mean theoretically, but there may be a number of other things that we need to be able to include. So how do we make sense of this? Just a few ideas here. First, dashboards are one way that we've tried to do things at Aid Data. Recently, in partnership with GFDRR, we've been able to create some dashboards, and I'm not even going to try to go to the live version of it, but let me see. There's kind of a brief display of a dashboard. These dashboards allow us to take different pieces of information and then be able to sort of include them all in one place. And there's a lot of information, and in some ways this can be a bit of a drawback. But we can begin to sort of find out more information, and as these dashboards get better developed, we'll be able to answer some of the questions we're interested in much better. Unfortunately, with this dual monitor thing, I'm not going to be able to control the mouse and actually point at anything. But you'll see what this, what this first map is capturing is just aggregate commitments for disaster-related aid that the GFDRR is interested in. We could go to sort of, if we were to scroll further down the page on this dashboard, we see other interesting information such as this graph here, which is a little bit difficult to understand, but it basically has the top donors for disaster aid. And then, if you, in real time, we could sort of hover on these things and be able to go over the lines, and at different years we can have sort of the best funded or sort of highest funded project from a given donor, and it displays with information on the side so that we can go and click on that and actually go directly to the data or the project data in the database. A variety of other things we can do in here. Actually, let me show one more. So we can then look at the map, and this was illustrated earlier in one of the talks, but we can go and click on these maps and get more information by country. And then the goal is to actually take that subnational as well. And to the extent we can take that and couple that with other information, we can begin to learn more about questions of interest. And then I should wrap up. So let me just say a bit more here. Real quick, visual analytics may be one other way we could go with this, and as a community we ought to identify ways to do visual analytics that are not overly complex, okay, but not too simple either. Some of the maps I displayed are maybe on the sort of err towards being a little bit too simple. But some of the visualizations we see, especially from the data analytics, are just very difficult for an end user, say at an NGO or in country, to be able to use. We need to find methods for visual analytics that are tractable but allow us to deal with 3 or 4 or 5 variables that may be in play at the same time. There's a whole lot of tabular data out there, and we shouldn't discard that in the rush for visualization. World Bank and a lot of other organizations have just enormous amounts of survey data at village levels and lower level administrative districts within countries. If we can figure out ways to take that information and couple it with our visualizations, this could make our work all the better. And in some ways we're rushing so fast on the technology end, we should think carefully about how we take data, tabular data and merge it in. And then finally, using sort of more scientific methods such as randomized controlled trials. And so one thing where Aid Data is doing with UNICEF in Uganda and Ushahidi is to try to understand how we can incentivize people to crowdsource information about development projects. And so we've begun a nationwide experiment. I've had some initial results thus far. But this is potentially fairly promising because it allows us to control for a lot of confounding factors and understand what drives behavior in giving information and providing information about development. And so bottom line, data and visualizations take us far, but we've got to keep our eye on the prize here and really go after how can we answer some of these causal questions that are most interesting. How is aid effective? So, okay, so that's all for our panel presentations, or from the panelists, but we'd really like to open it up as quickly as possible. We could respond to each other, but I think we'd much rather wait towards the end and we can chat afterwards. And so if there's questions, please go ahead. Is there a microphone that we can kind of pass around as people stand up? And could you just tell us who you are and who you're with?
My name is Scott Smith. I'm with e-diplomacy.
Sorry?
I'm with the State Department. You made the comment about making, kind of evaluating the effectiveness of aid. It seems to me that looked at from a bigger perspective, it's also about engaging the recipients of aid. It's not just a donor perspective, and that with social media, with some of the tools that you were alluding to but that we didn't get into with detail, creating a sense of ownership of the outcomes with the recipients as well. How do you see that going? As a sort of related comment, data being the plural of anecdote, the aggregation of data where detail is lost, and then part of what it seems to me that we're eventually aspiring toward is the disaggregation so that we have greater granularity. How do you see engaging with communities and the demand for transparency on the part of the receiving communities and countries? And I'm sorry, I'm not sure who to address that to, so I'll just throw it out there.
Does anyone else want to? I'm happy to comment, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're demonstrating is that people are willing to talk, and their voices can be captured in a way that's not purely anecdotal. You can layer data on top of it and link it together with other data sets to give it more color. So I think it's very much possible. I mean, the way to think about a good analog in day-to-day life is like a TripAdvisor or a Yelp. It's probably an oversimplification, but still, it's a valuable way to kind of think about that. I mean, what is the other perspective? And it's the tricky part is finding the right incentives to and the right reasons for people to actually volunteer that information. There has to be some benefit to that person in return, whether it's financial or emotional or just because there might be a result. But that's the tricky part that we're wrestling with right now with our own experiment. And how do you start that spontaneous flow of feedback like a Yelp or a TripAdvisor's been able to do? But it's possible. It's possible. We're demonstrating that it actually is possible.
Thanks, John. Karin, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Scott, that's really interesting and a huge question, lots to unpack there. You're absolutely right. This is not about aid information on its own. It's even in the most aid-dependent countries, domestic tax revenues are a larger proportion. So the big prize here is the ability to map it, link it with other sets of data, which is hence, even as a campaign for aid transparency, we're trying to get it onto government data sets mixed together. So there's something about getting this, boost type data mixed with IATI type data. That's when this gets exciting. That's when people in countries start, because they don't care really whether it comes from the US or Germany or Britain. They care what are they meant to be getting. They do care a bit. I mean, let's not pretend that it isn't interesting where the money comes from, and people have lots of things they want to say about that. But it's, we all know this, and I think federal spending.gov and those types of things have been very much around. I live in a very complicated bit of Britain, which is administratively overlaid by about 15 different administrative units. It is nigh and impossible for me in Brixton in London to figure out where resources are coming from. Or is it my council, whether it's central government, education, health spending, and that's a similar problem that we have in the US. And the only way we can solve that is via some of these data standard issues. I think the feedback loop and the ownership issue is incredibly important and very powerful, but I think we need to get some more data first before we start asking people sort of very partial things to feedback on. The other thing is I'm really, really unconvinced that governments are the best people to be designing this stuff. I mean, we don't have a great history in Western governments of designing really fantastic interactive tech that works for people. But there are people in this room and all over the planet that are brilliant at that stuff, so let them do it. So I think the real issue for me is, particularly for something like the State Department, what you guys have control over is your own data, and that's the difference between that project in Uganda costing £250,000 and it costing £7,000 or £8,000 because somebody can actually get the data and put it together because the data's out there. So, you know, it's all one of those things about us taking responsibility for the things we have control over, and the data's the most expensive part of this, and it's the hardest part of this to get at the moment. And then, you know, you guys can do some really cool stuff with it, but preferably not in PDFs is the other thing about the data being released.
Do you want to comment? I'll comment briefly. On the government side, I agree wholeheartedly, and in some ways that was the point I was trying to make, is that there's all these omitted variables right now when we're analyzing and we're sort of looking at these graphs, and aid data is just as guilty as World Bank and others at these early stages of throwing up these maps of aid and talking about aid versus how aid's impact on poverty or how aid's allocated with respect to poverty. Getting government budget information, is huge, right? But getting information from the private foundations would be extremely important as well, especially, say, in health area with some of the things Gates and others are doing. On the feedback loop part, I think this is a challenge. How do we aggregate this? And I know there's been lots and lots of discussions about how to aggregate and how to deal with this information. Let me just say a bit about what aid data is doing, and I'm not sure it's the best practice, but aid data is interested in knowing what the opinion is about specific aid projects, right? I mean, that's one particular outcome, and so aid data is developing what's called an enhanced project view, where for each aid project you can go into the database and look at all official information about the project kind of on one pane, and then clearly denoted on a separate pane is, here's a bunch of information from a grassroots level, right? And this could be individual citizens, it could be NGOs, it could be anyone, right? And there's lots of complexities here, right? People could try to flood this with all sorts of misinformation and whatever else, and those are things to talk through. But we see this as trying to do something to begin to have like actual statements, actual responses from people in a place that can be displayed. And then take that, and in many cases we can quantify some of this information and try to say, well, a certain district or a certain village feels about this way, right? Or they feel, at some level about some other idea. And so what we did in Uganda this summer, and what we're continuing to do, is we've randomized by district, and so we get information coming out of districts, and we've had about 30,000 people who have participated in providing feedback on mobile phones, and we're trying to then take the pulse of the district, so to speak, right? And say, we have lots of individual information, but we can also measure some things and kind of what's the mean level of support for this, that, or the other, right, across these different districts and based on different incentives for trying to get people to provide information. So, really good point, very challenging, and I think maybe through trial and error we'll begin to sort of learn some lessons here. Right here and then over here.
My name is Yong from University of Maryland. Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Hecklinger. Yeah, so about the global giving, so you showed us about the stories included in all those data. So can I really access to those data through your webpage? That is my first question. And second is, so you have so many projects spread all over the world. So how do you manage those so many projects? So how do you prioritize the projects? So how you can manage and provide those projects? So, yeah.
So yeah, answer to your first question is, it's not, you're welcome to the data. You have to email Mark, whose email is on globalgiving.org/stories, and he'll give you a data set. We just have to get that to you. I'll be happy to share that. We're working on ways to make it more self-serve. And the answer to your second question is actually very much related. We crowdsource pretty much everything we do at Global Giving. We crowdsource the identification of our partners around the world, the funding of those partners, and through this experiment, we're trying to see if we can crowdsource the monitoring of those partners. We also do staff visits and volunteer visits and require self-reports and a lot of less sexy stuff. But ultimately, we want to come up with a system that's very open and transparent and accessible for anybody in the world who wants to comment on the work that these organizations are doing as part of the basic monitoring. I think Global Giving has the luxury of not having to do in-depth evaluations of each of these grants, because it would be financially and logistically impossible to do so, with 1,500 partners each getting about $6,000 a year. So we have to experiment with alternative methods of managing that network, and this is one of the experiments that we're working on right now.
Please.
Hi, Michael Clark with International Media Solutions. This question, I guess, is for John and the storytelling to follow up, but maybe for the whole panel. Has there been any thought about using video and audio into the storytelling project as part? I'm wondering about language barriers and illiteracy, and if we're talking about making data truly visible, seeing is believing, and I'm wondering if you've sort of integrated that and how that might even fit into Mapbox or TileMill, linking those project stories to a YouTube and onto a map and so forth. Thank you.
There's the story, as long as the tagging is there, it can be in any form. It can be, most of the time it's been written. It could very well be videotaped or audio taped. The important thing is that there is an artifact that you can plow into and that it is tagged by the person who generated the story in the first place. We've done pencil and paper just because that's the most appropriate technology where we're working. And our strategy is a mass strategy, so it relies on gathering thousands and thousands of these stories, which if you're videotaping them, becomes a problem. It's harder logistically just to gather that many together. And the literacy issue, we actually work through a series of volunteer, or sometimes very modestly compensated scribes. So I might actually write down the story you're telling me if you're not capable of writing it yourself.
And I mean, to your technology question, so the point about TileMill and Mapbox, these are open source tools that allow you to design really custom maps. So on that note, yeah, you can absolutely put in pictures that you can interact with, or video. I think a really good example of that has been WFP. If you look at horn.wfp.org, they actually put their distribution centers in the Horn of Africa and overlay that with other contextual data, specifically like where the actual famine has been declared. And as you click on a specific point, you find out not only distribution details about how many people are being served there, but you can also pull up a couple of pictures in those various points. So the tech is definitely not a problem.
This is just maybe a slightly Luddite thought that's crossed my mind. I started off doing famine early warning in the mid-90s. In northern Kenya, and my biggest conclusion was that everybody there knew they were getting hungrier, and local government knew they were getting hungrier, and it didn't really take elaborate monitoring for anybody to know what was going on, which is not what anybody here is suggesting, but I do think we need to keep an eye on not putting vastly complicated infrastructures into things that the people on the ground already know, and one question would give you a sense of it, whereas we from the outside feel we need to have it in certain validated forms, which is more about the supply side. It's more than about local government being able to respond, and local governance and resources than it really is about actual monitoring. And it was an incredibly beautiful, actually, sophisticated, conceptually beautiful. Clearly, it was famine early warning, so it wasn't system, but we had no supply response. That was the block, not that there wasn't enough data or that it wasn't generating incredibly great maps. They were not as pretty as yours, and they were hand drawn, so they were painful to generate. But
I would seriously look at some of the great maps that have been released by aid around the Horn, specifically Raj's announcement up on Monday. What's especially exciting about that is FuseNet, the famine early warning system, has now broken out of their normal PDF paradigm and has released 5 years of data specific to the Horn on data.gov. And the fact that those food prices can be mapped, you start seeing some pretty interesting trends. So while the obvious point of hunger is neat relative to how hungry, you saw Tuff talking about some of this morning. Well, hey, these food prices now in southern Somalia are higher than late 2007, early 2009, and being able to quickly mouse over and see that on a map, and then see that same map also show rainfall going back 3 years, so where you missed the November, December rains, and seeing that on the same map that then is also showing the NDVI, Vegetation Index, data differential, actually showing what parts of the continent are brown. These are 3 really complex data sets that, so to the point, yes, people themselves might be able to say best when they're getting hungry, but complex data visualization will help us understand why they're getting hungry and where some of these situations are most acute.
You mentioned alternatives including video and audio, and I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity moving beyond just the flat bar charts and pixels on the screen. And everything from 1,000 years ago, drawing something in the sand, to physical models that you can hold in your hand. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of new opportunity in these areas of alternative visualizations, and I think audio and light and other mediums have a big role in that.
I'll just add quickly on the audio video, at least from AData's perspective. Our mapping prototypes we developed with ESRI have the functionality to add audio and video to them. We haven't exploited that yet, but it's something that we think is really valuable and want to do.
Hi, Matt Berg, and I do a lot of work in Africa also, and I realize the challenge of gathering data. Well, not the challenge, but my question relates to, if we're talking about data transparency and issues of crowdsourcing in particular, so example, your project in Uganda, what's our responsibility to get the information back to the people that we're gathering the data from? And what are the strategies we're looking at? So, are there toolkits for making simple maps for newspapers or radio fact sheets? So how can we leverage kind of existing media in places like Africa to share this information back? And what's our responsibility as we're gathering this data to think about providing that back from the source?
Yeah, I can start off with that. I mean, and it's frankly one of the things that we're trying to figure out now. I mean, we feel like we absolutely do have a responsibility to get that information back to the people who contributed in the first place because they cared enough to take the time to do that. The question is how to make it meaningful and useful. We've thanked everybody by SMS, so I mean, that's courteous. It's a start. We've acknowledged the receipt of their stories, and we've done in-person meetings where we can to regather people and groups who have told the stories and to feed them back. So we're starting to do that. The struggle is how can we, in a lower touch, higher tech way, if possible, do something that's more of a self kind of reinforcing cycle, and that's a question that we're working through right now. But it won't happen unless there's a feedback to the person who's done it. And the reason Yelp works is that I see my stuff online. That's what YouTube's all about, seeing your goofy brother doing air guitar online. That's the incentive. And from what we're hearing from the folks who are telling these stories, that is actually part of the reason why they're comfortable and willing to do this in the first place, is that it will be online on the internet, their story will be there. And that's a good and satisfying thing in and of itself. That said, it's not totally sufficient if they can't then actually see it or get some information back about what's being done with it.
Go ahead, Karen.
I was going to say, an old dilemma, it's where rapid research appraisals, the RRA system turned into participatory research assessments, and it's a responsibility, I think, that we get off slightly lightly into the international development sector because it's regulated domestically often in the north, whereas in developing countries often there isn't that kind of the same level of privacy laws or data protection laws, or how does this stuff relate. So I think it's incumbent on all of us that are doing this stuff to actually take this, as everybody here I think is, very seriously as to how that happens. I think the big question is also why we want the information and being clear about what the purpose of it is. And some of it being extractive is fine for that. Some of it just knowing it and having it as global data sets is public goods should not be underestimated. There is such a thing as a public good. Others which are actually about the ability to hold somebody to account, there's not much point designing a system that's about feedback if they can't then hold people to account with that. So I think it's a lot about the questions you're asking and the data you're getting. So it's not a nice, easy answer, but it's an old and long-standing dilemma that I think is partly about research ethics. But in a new generation of technology, we have to bring that old debate live into that kind of modern, or not modern, that current setting where technology has changed the relationships.
I'll comment briefly too. As an academic, I get to face the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, more often than I would like, so this is something that I have to deal with all the time. Is trying to understand at what point do you inform people, how much do you inform them up front, afterwards, of all these things. And unfortunately, I'm not sure we have great answers in sort of at the aggregate, but maybe just give you a sense of a little bit of what we've done with aid data to try to disseminate information back. We've been trying with our crowdsourcing RCT that we're doing. We've designed several different interventions that we exploit, and one of them that we're trying out right now to try to understand how this affects response rates and quality response and satisfaction and so forth is to send back information to people that are responding within like social networks, and try to give them something a little bit more than, here's what one person said, but rather say something like, here's sort of the collective pulse of your network, here's the collective pulse of another network in terms of like what we're hearing, and to see how they sort of respond to that type of information. And so I realize that's a very sort of a very small step in that direction of trying to understand how to provide information back and what's satisfactory. But I think that we're trying to begin exploring some of those things to see what levels of information, how much, what types, individuals or NGOs would like in response to what they do.
Hi, my name is Maura. I'm here at the Pulitzer Center. My question is regarding more specifically data journalism. I'm interested in what common pratfalls you see journalism organizations and individual journalists making when they make their first forays into data journalism and visualization, and also who's doing it really well, especially at the international level, if there is anyone.
Yeah. New York Times, Chicago Tribune. You should follow Brian Boyer on Twitter. Some of the actual data maps they're making are just fantastic. I think what's going to start getting exciting is actually being able to treat some of these visualizations actually as content. They can start dropping into stories, and I think there's and really start having within the conversation that you're describing as a journalist, visualizations that help better show what's going on a lot easier without having to build out a full-on app. A lot of the journalists that are doing it well will tell you they're doing it by circumventing their internal IT infrastructure and trying to leverage open source tools. So this whole hacker journalism space is really super exciting. And I think they're doing actually some of the best work out there. I'll be happy to send you a couple links of people that I really admire in the space. So.
Maybe just to second that, I think there's you'll often find it's 2 or 3 people. So I know a couple of people in the FT that do this. They don't use their internal IT. They the Guardian data stuff is also getting a lot better in the UK.
The data blogs.
Yeah. So I think the Guardian and NYT are probably the 2 of the best, but they're often also working with academic departments. But I think this may well be the future of journalism, because with the ability to write a blog and that and people's opinions are becoming so easy to put on the web that I think there's a set of things about reporting that are no longer necessary in some senses. So the added value that newspapers give, I think, is going to be increasingly to interpret complicated data sets that actually you or I can't do rather than you or I can do. I mean, that probably doesn't apply to most people on this panel. They might be able to interpret them. But, that I think there's something in there, and, journalism schools are increasingly teaching this stuff. But it's a mixed skill set, and there's a challenge that most journalists have come back from an enjoyment of words, not an enjoyment of data. And I think our education systems aren't necessarily generating the right skill sets for this to some extent. That we actually produce literate and numerate people rather than one or the other certainly in Britain, it's a huge challenge.
I've noticed that the New York Times has done exceptionally well. So a whole series of very simple data visualization maps that cover all kinds of different sectors. And what they do really well is they don't do too much. They're very narrowly focused. It's more about consumption. You can go to these visualization tools and explore a part of the world and immediately consume the message, see the story, understand the picture. It's not analytic tools and features and functions, but very simple. And I think that's an important message, that when we build these tools, to remember simplicity is one of our important objectives.
Great, thanks. I think we maybe have time for one more question. Someone had their hand up over here.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to start sort of with a comment at the risk of sort of trying to turn this into a question. I don't know whether I'm the only one, but I kind of got a sense on this panel that we heard both views of there being, I'm talking specifically in the area of aid and aid data, there being a data deluge as well as a data scarcity. I work a lot with aid data. I work at a small think tank up in Canada, and I'm kind of trying to get around this issue of whether we have too much of it and we don't actually know how to make proper sense of it, where we are on that sort of continuum. So I use, for example, aid data. And Canada is one of the countries, our donor agency is not signing up to IATI and hasn't signed up to IATI so far. So one of the counter arguments we've heard back is that, look, well, a lot of the stuff that you want to do, you're already able to do. So I've got detailed project level information, which I get from Aid Data Development Gateway. So I'm trying to understand whether it's a matter of where we are on the spectrum of the amount of information that's been made available and the amount that is processable and digestible for any useful purpose. My second point is about the kind of relationship about causality that we've been talking a lot about. So we've talked a lot about aid and poverty, and then we've seen these charts about whether we can make a causal inference between where aid goes and where the poverty and where the need is. But what about, and what is the panel's thinking specifically in the area of aid transparency, about the causality between aid transparency and aid effectiveness? So has there been any demonstration, anything that you can think of with what we've got so far, if we've come further along this graph of more data being made available, that it's actually made aid more effective?
Shall I give that a go?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment too, but go ahead, please.
So deluge versus scarcity, this is a cop-out, but it's both, right? We've got, and we're going to launch a report in November. We did a ranking of donors last year, which the World Bank came top of. But the main finding, there wasn't enough primary comparable data. So this year we're trying to actually look at what exactly each donor is producing. And we've got about 38 different data information items from the whole project cycle, from planning to execution and audit. Is it available? And the answer is that there is a huge amount out there, but it's a very patchy. It's not clear. You know, it's for some projects you'll get it for the US. There's a lot of information on Afghanistan because there's a project database, but then there's nothing on a whole bunch of other countries, and there's nothing systematic about what's disclosed, and why it's disclosed or not disclosed is very difficult to figure out. But it's enormously patchy. And that different people want different parts of that data. So everybody just could put a huge amount more data out there, and then I think we'd have a deluge. If you put it out there in a structured way, then it turns a deluge into something useful, because you can search it and you can find transaction level in Uganda, and I can find whatever, people can actually then search and find it. So it's about how the data is structured, and I think most of us would take a bit of a trade-off for quantity, for the ability to search it. And I think that's what makes it useful. There's a really great diagram that AidInfo did, which was publish many times, use rarely, and then publish once, use often. And that's where we've got to try to get, so that you only have to, because State Departments are being asked on a nigh on daily basis different questions about their up to, whether it's from Congress, whether it's from other donors, from all over the place. It would be much easier if the data was put out there once, and it's structured in a way that all of those different constituencies know where to go and find it. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to bug State Department, but it might bug them less about what they're doing and more about how and why and whether they think it's a good idea. So it doesn't reduce the number of questions you get, but it changes category order, the type of question. In terms of causality, so we're in a sector in international development that has a significant tendency to overclaim. We do something small here and we've made the world a better place. I think, and we're very clear in Publish What You Fund, that aid transparency is necessary but not sufficient. It is not going to make donors coordinate better. It's not going to result in greater levels of ownership by partner countries, or better development policy in partner countries, because they can actually see the health spending, or more kids actually not being immunized 3 times. We've got cases of this, particularly after the tsunami, of kids getting measles because they were immunized 3 times with measles injections. But just try doing all of those things without it. The issue is it's not going to cause them, and I think we have to be very careful not to assert that it'll cause them, but it's nigh on impossible to do it without them. And I think we've got ourselves into a bit of a framing of we have to prove causality as opposed to demonstrate the logical flow. This isn't about randomized controlled timing, it's about hypotheses and chains of causality, and you can't get to the end of it if the sufficient conditions aren't there, but some of the necessary ones. And I think aid transparency is a necessary condition, but by no means sufficient for all the other stuff that's going on or needs to happen.
The only thing I would add to that is every single open data project I've been on, the data has gotten better, or you've been able to see more problems with the data when it's open. Yeah. Whether that's election mapping in Afghanistan, whether it's data.World Bank. I mean, look, the first week the US broadband map was out, there was a giant black spot on the center of the map that looked a lot like Arkansas. Again, until you really start looking at this, it's incredible. So just if data matters for your decision making, then having better data is good. And if opening data makes that data better, that's good.
Great. Very well put, both responses. I've also got some opinions on this, as I suspect the others do, but I think we've had our cue that we're about up. Thank you very much for your interest, for being here, for your participation, and a special thanks to the panelists for their contributions.
our neighbors? Yeah, we can tilt. That's a great idea. Let's see. Let's kind of test and learn here. See if there's any issue. I like it. Yeah. It's very thoughtful of you. Oh. Welcome, sir. If I can trouble you to sit on that side of the aisle, I try to stay as far away from those loud cars as possible. And also, if you can sit as close to the front as possible, that'll allow us to avoid shouting. Oh, yeah, no, it's very smart. Had a bunch of questions, there you go. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. But even so, yeah. Okay. So can folks hear me in the back without a microphone? Or should we turn the microphone on just slightly? Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. Let's see. So I guess we're ready to get started with a panel on this incredibly important question of turning information, which you cannot deposit in the bank, into insight, which presumably you can use to do something valuable, possibly deposit it in the bank, or at the very least save money or save lives or do something that really does have a tangible, concrete value. We have an amazing panel, including Greg Elin, who's the Chief Data Officer at the FCC, after an illustrious career that included the Sunlight Foundation that I'm sure many of us know and admire. But he's brought that background to the incredibly important concept of treating data as an asset at the FCC, and has amazing experiences and perspective based on that. Jonathan Cousins is an experienced data visualization technologist with very much of a business-centric or goal-centric approach, where he begins with the question of, well, what exactly is it that you do, and solves complicated problems using data visualization as a source of agility and a source of results. And of course, Layla Shaker is an amazing, one-of-a-kind artist who's also a data analyst and visualizer, for whom, in fact, it's one of the same. The art is the visualization of data. And then, of course, John Gossier is here with a remarkable set of background work. It's both private sector as well as social good oriented, and was very involved in work in Africa that he'll be telling you more about. So we're going to learn a lot from this panel. I myself, just to briefly introduce you, am kind of the generalist here. I'm the guy who, in my private sector work, helps clients to make that journey from data as a raw material, as an asset, to something that you can actually deposit in the bank, and that's a long journey. And I'm very passionate to be here because that journey is even more meaningful when the result is not a dollar, but it's something of value, using scarce dollars to produce something of value, whether it be aid or disaster response, et cetera. So without further ado, we're going to give each of the panelists maybe about 10 minutes and ask them if they could speak to their essence, their body of work, but also their thoughts on how that relates to the goals of this conference, which are to make data visualization more impactful within the social sector in a variety of ways. So with that, John, I'd be delighted to see your presentation.
Thanks. My name is John Gossier from a company called MetaLayer. We deal in what I call the atomization of content. So detecting the features of text or visual data and using that to empower search decisions, indexing decisions, other types of insight into that information, right? So not just the information itself, but the features that make up that information. Before I talk about that, I wanted to just sort of run you through a bit of background. I'm a big data visualization fan, freak, lover of. I went to art school, and that informed a lot of my tech work.
I apologize for interrupting. I've been informed by our staff, our data visual staff actually, that we must speak into the microphone,
Okay.
although not too loud.
Okay, so new audio data for you. So this is a report that we published on our blog. It's free. It's an infographic that's about the size of sort of like the visual data market, specifically images. So one of the things that we wanted to sort of detect is like, what is the size of the market of information that theoretically has not been indexed by search engines which scrape text. Although there's visual search from Google, from Bing, it's very much about the text surrounding images, not what's in the images. So we wanted to know what's the potential capacity of like the web for visual data that's not indexed. And that's growing exponentially as mobile, as more non-networked or more networked devices that aren't computers come online and so on. And so here you can see the size of MMS, the global MMS market in comparison to Facebook, Google Images, and Bing, which is that little tiny Pluto-looking planet down in the corner. So you can check that out. I think it's very interesting, and it's got some information that may not be relevant to you, but it does tell you a lot about how much visual data is consumed. And this is taking a deeper look at the size of Facebook to what's commonly known as the biggest social network, which is Flickr, which is actually really small in comparison. So that's just the amount of visual data captured in those markets alone. So MMS and Facebook dwarf everything else by far. And so we were interested in trying to capture that type of information. So, and I'll talk about how we do that, but I'll talk first about my background, which is I just recently left a company called Ushahidi. Ushahidi deals with visualizing geospatially SMS data collected from the public during disaster scenarios. They've become very well known for this. This is their project in Liberia. It's one type of data visualization, right? It's one type of narrative of data collected from the public and then presented in a certain kind of way. And we've heard a lot about geospatial data today, so I'm going to skip that and talk about other types of visualization. Here you have a couple of different types. You've got a color map, a heat map. You've got what I call a spectral graph, which is over in the far, I guess it's on your far left, which is here with Zimbabwe, Uganda, Nigeria, Morocco. Those bars actually correlate to the size of the underlying data, which was measuring the number of people who are online in that country, right? And so and that all correlates to the heat map, which I've just sort of drawn these different things to show you exactly where they correlate, to show you the capacity of that country of percentage of internet users online versus the number of people in those countries. So it's packed full of information, so you can dive into that. That's also available from our site. You can just Google InfoState from Africa, you'll find it. And then this one, which is my favorite, which is very simple. I just wanted to know how many people have ever lived and how many people are alive right now. And so the white space represents how many people have ever lived. The red space represents the number of people who are alive right now. And these circles are proportionate. So there's a base number, which is 7 billion, and then using the area of the circle, that's the correlation between the white circle and the red circle, right? And then the white outer ring is it represents that sort of gap between what we suspect conservatively and what we suspect liberally to be the number of people who've ever lived. And so my reason for making this was about the carrying capacity of the planet, and we learned about earlier today from Tufty about having a sort of mission for data visualizations. I didn't really start with a mission, but when I looked at the data and learned that 7 billion people were alive now, and the estimated theoretical carrying capacity of the Earth is about 10 billion, I freaked out a little bit, because that's not, that number is going to close very soon. So something to lose sleep over. And real quick, before I hand it over to the rest of the panel, I'll talk about MetaLayer and what we do. So at the beginning, I talked about the atomization of content. And so what do I mean by that? We pull in information, feeds of information, collections of information. It doesn't have to be real time, although we're really good at detecting real-time features, extracting values from that data. So, for instance, if it's a Twitter message or an SMS message, those don't often carry location. We try to detect location data from the message itself, as opposed to any sort of metadata that may be sent. And this is sort of what this looks like. You have the text here. This is what's called JSON, right? It's code. But if you could analyze what's going on here, in the red, you have the actual message that is being sent through, which is like our mission statement. And then in the JSON data, you can see that we're looking for locations. We're looking for a taxonomy layer, which is what I've started to color going down that column. Product streams, text, images. That's being pulled out of the message and then used to help classify that longer message. And we look for other things like sentiment and other features. In images, we give you back different metadata. So the size of the image, the histogram, so like literally the color profile of the entire image, because you can use that to statistically correlate other images to it. The colors, the RGB colors that make up the image, and then some other metadata. And so what can you do with this? Because that's what we're talking about. So there's two types of data we deal with, right? We deal with text data, we deal with image data. So with textual data, you can spot trends. A lot of us are very comfortable dealing with text, manipulating text. What we're really passionate about is taking that, doing that really well, and then taking that and applying it to images. So searching the text in images, geolocating images based on the features detected from the image, not metadata generated by humans, and just generally trying to speed up the process of making the process more efficient of dealing with information. And that's what MetaLayer does. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting, and looking forward to learning more about it. I have one just quick announcement, which is that we are going to spend a lot of time listening to your questions and having the esteemed panelists address them. If you have a question and you'd like to tweet, and you tweet that to my name, @Jamie Fitzgerald, I'll be reading it here, and we'll use that as another source of questions. If you prefer to simply raise your hand, that's fine too. So continuing on, speaking of Twitter, Layla.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? So my name is Layla Shireen Saad, and I'm a second-year doctoral student at the University of Southern California in a program called Media Arts and Practice in the School of Cinematic Arts. I came there via 12 years in Washington, D.C., and a master's degree from Georgetown University in Arab Studies. And I have to say that that experience definitely led me to say I need to go figure out new ways of how to approach knowledge production on the Middle East, and ventured out to UC Santa Cruz in 2007. So I left DC 4 years ago, and I did a master's in fine arts and digital arts and new media. And my PhD is really a combination of both. So why am I here today? I'm here because I started building something called archive. It's the Arabic word for archive. That was my MFA thesis, actually, the prototype. And I've been aggregating, collecting data on the internet in the Arabic language specifically since 2008. And we have right now one of the most comprehensive repositories on the Arab Spring specifically, because I had started this archiving endeavor before. And when the Arab Spring began, Let me just stop for a moment. Let me go back. So the title of my talk is called Collecting and Analyzing Social Media on the Arab Spring, New Approach to Knowing the Middle East. I had a little moment of thinking, a little second thought about my own title. I have a problem with the word Arab Spring, a little concern. First of all, it's a become widely used term, and that's why I'm using it, because people understand. However, it's not what the people in the Middle East are using to call their own revolution. They use the word thawra, which means revolution, or they use the word thawrat al-karama, which means the revolution of dignity. And I think that's a bit more apt of what's going on, rather than thinking about jasmine and spring and flowers and making light. So just wanted to go back, and so a little footnote. So we're talking about, social media platforms like Facebook that has 178,000 people. So these are large communities of people worth looking at. So what I've come to as of last week, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to you how I came to this. Archive has been able to collect data, and I've been spending most of my time enhancing my collecting tool, getting it on the cloud computing, and dealing with this immense escalation of data over the last several months. This here is a Gephi graph. We're beginning to start looking at the flows. We're interested in looking at the flows of tweets among users vis-a-vis language. Here you have a representation of 500,000 tweets on the hashtag Syria over 30 days by 60,000 users in the month of August last month. And this is the colors are distributing by language. The languages are distributed by color. So here's Archive. This is it's a website. You can go to it, archive.org. The idea to actually begin data mining Twitter began just last year. So Archive began in 2008. So we were analyzing the entire internet, but we got interested in analyzing Twitter specifically because I went to an Arab Techie women's conference in Beirut where there were 30 women, and we decided to use the hashtag ATWomen and document the conference, and it was fabulous. And I went back, and I went back 10 days later, and I was unable to get that data because it's gone. So I built this thing called Twitter Miner. And basically, fast forward to today, we now have Archive Labs. And what we do is we collect and analyze Middle East content on the internet. And we provide data-centric tools and methods for research and publication and cultural productions. The purpose is for this data to be publicly accessible and for new research to be done. So we basically, every 2 minutes, we are storing over 200 Twitter feeds by hashtag, 65 Twitter feeds by user, 18 Facebook public pages, and 47 websites and blogs. I have to note that all of this data is from the public sources. I'm only pulling from the Twitter public search API, which is very important because that could be only 1% of the sample data. In which case, what does that mean about what I'm looking at? ... That's worth another conversation. But I just want to footnote that I am only using the search API, but I've refined my method to know that I'm gathering as much as I possibly can from that. We have also built something called a Twitter Nommer. So basically, this is a little bit of AI. It's a machine learning algorithm that goes through our database and pulls out character by character, it distinguishes the language of the tweet. Because in Twitter, if you pull from the API, it tells you the languages by the user's choice of what their language is that they speak. But that's not very accurate when you're dealing with multilingual users in the Middle East. So I've created this system. So now it's actually, it gets smarter and smarter as it builds. So it's this machine learning thing. And so I'm building a lexicon of Twitter. Because Twitterese is like 140 characters. It's not normal language. So now I'm excited because I've got a year of data that I can trend, and I can start seeing, different changes over time in Arabic. And when January 25th happened, all I had to do was add the hashtag, those 7 characters, and boom, I started aggregating that. And within about 3 days after, on February 12th, I was able to publish this. I was able to I had been aggregating the data, so I just, exported it and put it into this Many Eyes free IBM tool. Again, I've been spending all my time just aggregating. I want to get to my visualizing, but you got to understand the information. So I throw it in there, and I see video is history. That was really a powerful insight to pull. And you see, it's not video is history, it's video is history in the making. That's what they're saying. And you see the retweets, there's 66 of them. This is a Many Eyes tool. It's a really cool tool. It goes through the data and it pulls out a visualization of 2 words, and it pulls out meaning by phrases rather than by sentences. And so you have here the ability to choose a word that connects 2 words and see what are all the phrases that come up that are connected by the conjunction and, or by the preposition of the, or by the predicate is. I also realized that there's a media convergence going on here. It's in the data. You can see that. Facebook, Twitter, and Google. People in Egypt are tweeting about that. So then we moved into another step. I said, all right, let me take these IBM tools, we're using them, and I thought, okay, let's try to see if we can do some sort of natural language processing. So we created these data models. I wanted to go through the data and see what is the positive and negative sentiment of people who are tweeting about Egypt. What are their feelings about potential Egyptian candidates? Green is positive, red is negative. I went to Egypt and I presented this, and people started laughing at me. And they said, you know what? Murtada Mansour is the laughing stock of Cairo. How could he be all positive? And I'm like, wow, that's pretty impressive. I'm not able to pull up jokes. So my method, my model in this traditional model wasn't able to pull up the jokes accurately. I went back, we now got it working in Arabic. What's exciting about this is that the Arabic you see there, that sentiment model, that's from the user to the graph, it's all done in Arabic, which allows for a lot more insight to be gained. You're not doing any translation into English here. So what's exciting is now, I went in and I pulled up the same data that I had. Those images that you saw were done in July. I pulled up similar images in September. You saw the time change. In the last several months, the tweets became much fewer about the president's elections, and they all became red. And I only actually have, these are only actually 10 tweets that my model actually was able to get. So either there are people not talking about presidents in Twitter, it's not worth it, or really the overall sentiment is negative, or what can we discern from that? So I've moved on to realize that I need to create what I'm calling a communicative logic of tweets. I'm creating my own taxonomy of tweets, because it's not that Twitter is used for one purpose. There's actually a fractured society, where there's a bunch of fractured groups, and they're all using it for different reasons. And so I figured if I can come up with a better taxonomy, I can start doing more intelligent data visualizations. And so this is part of something I came to put together when I was analyzing Libya 2 weeks ago. Before they went into Tripoli, I got a text message saying the rebels took over Zawiya, wow. So I quickly went into my Twitter miner and I did this graph. I started seeing that basically I saw that there was this sudden rise in tweets on Zawiya and these word clouds. And the same words that were coming up were like now, start, begin, were happening about the same time the day before as they were happening on the hashtag on Tripoli. I'm not making any sense. I'm speaking very fast. So backtrack. So I basically looked at this data the day after Tripoli fell. I got a text saying that Tripoli fell. I go into the database the day later. Now the Zawiya, the rebels are moving towards Tripoli now, right? That's known. And I'm like, wow. And I see what happened the day before in Zawiya, and I'm seeing the same stuff appear that day, in that moment, real time, on Tripoli. So I make this prediction that 18 to 36 hours, Tripoli is going to fall, and I was 8 hours off. So I'm not sure that that's really sort of prediction, that is forecasting. It's just really hot, super, 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 super real time. My approach to data is really not to data mine. I'm interested in data exploration. I'm not interested in necessarily telling you what is out of it. I'm more interested in defamiliarizing. My approach to data is through something called cultural analytics. Those of you who know about Lev Manovich and the work he's doing at UC San Diego and those guys, it's really interesting. There's a design model by Nathan Shedroff that explains this a little bit, where you pull the data and I sort of changed it to make sense in Egypt. You pull the data from structured and unstructured feeds from Facebook, then they become information when you get people posting about them and telling you who's liking them and who's commenting on them. And then you are able to find knowledge. You're able to get knowledge when you can do the visualizations and when the patterns of culture emerge. And these patterns of culture will emerge differently in these visualizations than you might imagine, and then ultimately we'll be able to gain insight. My personal question about the Middle East is, what is the nature of revolution in a digital age without a charismatic leader? So I'm coming to the point where I'm making these really, I'm beginning to understand, to look at, rather than going into the data and mining and doing these sort of semantic or sentiment analysis, I'm more interested in looking at the overall network. What you see here is a network where all of those nodes are the tweets, the lines are the flow and the retweets between users and between tweets. And so you get a sense of the actual movement, the flow of the entire network. I'm interested in people being able to understand the pulse. When you look at this, this is Syria. This is the same time, this is about 30 days of Syria in August. And I look at this and I say, wow, this is really cohesive. The green is Arabic, the blue is English. However, it's rather round. So there's a strong conversation on Syria and they're rather cohesive. This is Egypt. If you see Egypt, it's not quite as round, it's more triangular. Okay. The next step, I'm moving into animating these. I'm in the process of animating and making these interactive. One of the things I've done is I pulled out this data every Friday. So here you've got, this is going to be animated soon. 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 week. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you. Thank you very much. Continuing onward to Jonathan Cousins. It may take a moment to get his presentation up. Maybe I'll just say a few more words about the bigger picture frame here. It's amazing to hear the subject matter expertise and life's work that continues to evolve by the speakers, because in a sense it fits into this broad question of how we as human beings and as practitioners in our own area of practice can participate in this value stream, if you will, as data becomes information, knowledge, wisdom, but most importantly, as data does what Tufte describes, which is allow you to intervene and do something better, especially in the social good space. So with that said, we're about to see some amazing things.
As some of you saw, I spoke this morning, and so I'm not gonna repeat most of that. I'm just gonna very quickly sum up that stuff. In our practice, we work in a whole range of areas, doing data visualization, using data visualization, development, and design techniques.
Please speak into the mic.
Yeah.
There are people in far-flung parts of the globe watching you on live stream.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So as I mentioned, earlier, that we work in a variety of different practice areas, doing data visualization and using that as a way of conducting our practice and solving problems in a whole range of different technological design scenarios. So, there's our hexacopter technology. When we use visualization and agile techniques to look at the information we get, to improve our math, do everything we need to for that. For the artwork, with the piece that I introduced earlier for Abacus, we developed a whole screen network and a way of working with real data and to create an art piece that a new media piece that will be able to stand the same test that something like the piece on the bottom, which was a very hardcore web-based technology that had best practices of a RESTful interface and as Greg was one of the people who introduced me several years ago to the value of that, and was of course something that was built on top of a very experimental and a unique and elegant database that was designed by some people, including Greg and some other folks here in DC, and to be able to express that something that was had this tremendous commercial power is done by us in the same way that we do art, in the same way that we do mainstream media pieces like the one for Popular Mechanics in the upper right-hand corner, and of course, our hardware. I wanted to share two very quick examples about insights, and then I'm going to pass on to Greg. One from the very beginnings of when I got into data visualization, and then one I was just telling someone about at lunch that was within the last week or so. So the first one was I was working with CIA World Factbook data on very, very early on as I was getting into this on the countries of the Middle East. And so I'd gotten to the point where I had developed this code base for it and these series of interactions, animations, and designs, and I had actually entered data. And so I'm playing along with this, and I'm looking at these various data points, and I look at the countries of the Middle East plotted based on the amount of water per square kilometer. And Iraq was way off, and I was like, this is ridiculous. It's the Middle East, it's the desert, and so I must have entered it wrong. That was my first thought. I must have entered the data wrong. So I'm looking back, I checked the data. No, it's right. I checked it a couple times. And then I realized, it's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Relative to the other countries, there's a great deal more. So, Tufty mentioned about making the user smarter. And I think there are also times when the user already is smart, and it reminds them of intelligence that they have already. And that's a huge asset, I think, a lot of times when you have a moment in data visualization where it causes you to think a certain way or ask a certain question, and you draw on something you've already learned, and a kind of complexity that you couldn't, I don't know if we will ever be able to get out of a machine. So that was one example, and the other one is actually this one. I was sort of in the process of pitching a big project, and I had made a point in a previous meeting, they like what we're saying, but I'd made a point that they weren't quite following, which was you can tap into that pre-existing intelligence and complexity that forms that intelligence with these very, very subtle design choices. And whether they're about your information architecture or whether or not they're about just your UI graphic design choices, or in most cases probably somewhat of both, you can do that. So a couple of years ago, my wife and I bought a car, and I got very familiar with this particular format of a table, which some of you may recognize from Consumer Reports. So, and those of you who've done this, either recently or are very familiar with this table, know already what this table is telling you. Okay, that's familiarity. So, even when you're new to this, once you look at this legend at the top with what those circles mean, you can go back to this, understand that this is a period of time, check to the left and see it's transmission major, transmission minor, and drive system, and probably draw a conclusion that at that point in history, there was a problem in the drive systems at Volvo. That is a heck of a thing to say when you're not an industrial engineer, when you're not an economist, when you know nothing about that industry, but you have a pretty significant certainty, and there's probably a greater than 50% chance that you're right, all because of this very simple type of presentation that is, and data representation that is skipped over in this kind of conversation. Because we're always looking for these big giant maps and these beautiful moments. This blew my mind when I realized what was going on in my head. So it's this idea that the user already is smart, has thinking done, that they can just have drawn out by just your simple conventions like this. So that was just the one thing I wanted to add.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I have to say, Jonathan, that it was like an amazing setup for what I'm showing for my little presentation here.
Yeah. Perfect. Good.
Yes.
I'm glad.
No.
Push things together. I think I had that same problem.
success.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's see if that's... Okay. All right. All right, let me start up a little timer so I can keep keep an eye on the time. All right, okay. So my presentation is a little bit about simple visualization or stuff. I have some visualization envy of all the work that everyone is presenting. So the first thing, saving hours with, saving real hours in government as a part of workflow with visualization. So I'm going to, little group participation. What do you think of, what do you imagine when I say Moby Dick? Whale, anything else? Ahab?
A very long boat.
A long boat? Anything else? Restaurant. Okay, all right. Right. The whale, Captain Ahab, the book, and of course Moby Dick, House of Kebabs, right. So I think we do it. Now, taking that a little bit further, I actually did some research when I was an undergraduate about what people visualize when they read fiction. And so these were the questions I interviewed a number of people about. Do the words ever, and you can think about these yourself, do you visualize when you read fiction? Do the words ever disappear while you're reading? Like, I always see the words. I always see the words, never vanish from me. When you're watching, is it immersive or is it like watching a movie? And what's your point of view? Are you a fly on the wall or are you eye level with the main characters? Or are you a character in it as well? And it's very, and people actually have different experiences. And of course, the best one to ask people was, you know, do they like the movies that are made from books that they read? And how did they react to that? So I think to some extent, book is to movie, roughly. I know we don't always like the interpretation as data is to visualization. And another way to think about it is a book plus a reader equals mental images and understanding, and data to an engineer also equals mental images and understanding. That things come to our mind. And I think, Jonathan, to your point, the participant is actually part of the system. What they bring, with the knowledge that they happen to bring to the table. So I'm going to give a shout out to Kim Reese with a couple of slides here from Periscopic, who I met at Wolfram Data Summit. And I think I don't know if I have an exact quote here, but visualization of bring the invisible into the realm of the knowable and comprehensible. Am I close, Kim? Right. Okay, so I really liked that image of make something invisible and then making it knowable. And in fact, so I'm going to show a little demo that a little movie from a visualization that Periscopic had done, which is of processing Yahoo email messages in real time. I think that I'm noticing that this is some real important trends in data visualization and the usefulness. It's real time. It's interactive. There are controls that allow me to explore the information more, and it's dynamic. You know, that it's not just showing me one thing, but I do think getting into the realm of sequences of time, of animation, it's really important, particularly for complex data and for governments, et cetera. Now, so I'll let this play a little bit more. You can see the different controls that are available. I also really love the richness of that there's a timeline underneath it, that there's several layers of information that's being presented. And even the storytelling of some of the meetings are visualizations themselves to communicate the story. So I question that what we don't really represent well at the FCC right now is what's happening on the network, what's happening right now. The spectrum licensing market is actually a fairly vibrant market. People are leasing licenses from each other all the time. People are selling licenses. There's things that are happening. We don't have a representation of that as we do of other marketplaces right now. So what I'm actually going to show you, though, is this is I was a little panicked because I didn't have any really sexy visualizations to bring from the FCC. And my colleague, Mike Byrne, who's worked on the National Broadband Map, suggested I tell this story, which is essentially, here's something we're working on right now, a system that we're doing, and I want you to imagine this in terms of FCC engineers and that they have to visualize FM radio interference. Someone applies for a new radio, a new broadcast station or radio license, or they're modifying it. Is it going to interfere with other stations? All right, so that's space. Is there an improper overlap where you get the two stations coming into your radio at once? What kind of interference? And then, in fact, now, there are all these rules, these textual rules around what that interference is. And the engineers understand it, and the lawyers understand some of it. But there are all these rules, and in fact, they have to be separated, and the definition of their separation is defined by a table of data. So this is very complex. Now, if you happen to be an engineer, you have trained for years to understand this stuff. And we actually have some tools at the FCC, some older tools, legacy tools, that help people work with this information. But it still assumes a lot of the expertise of the engineer. And it leverages that expertise. So they have to say, well, this is the radio I'm working with, this is the analysis I'm going to do, I'm going to pick the rule that I'm applying it against, and I'm going to get a printout. And I'm going to look at that printout, and I'm going to look at another printout. And I'm going to start scanning those numbers. And I've been in school for years. I've been at the FCC. I'm an engineer. These numbers mean something to me. I'm looking through them. I'm seeing little things. Okay, yeah, there are those asterisks there. I have to go look at that especially because that's an overlap. So I've abbreviated this presentation, but you get a sense of the engineers are getting the application, they're processing it, they're running it through programs, they're getting printouts, and they're really carrying a heavy cognitive load to figure out what's going on. And it takes real hours to process this stuff. And now you feed some of the data you have into a system to get a plot. So you can look at it really exactly. And this is what the plot comes out that looks like. So it's a simple visualization, but this is hours of work to get to this point. And then we have hundreds of licenses that are being processed every month. So looking at this. All right, so how can we save time with visualization? I think a lot of it is putting some of that cognitive load onto the computer. You're still leveraging the expertise, but the computer is speeding up, making some of these invisible things knowable. So I'm actually going to show you some screenshots of something that we're testing. This is purely a back-end system that we're doing right now. We looked at it to help our engineers process the applications. But one of the first things we did is we've cleaned up the interface, and we're using just simple visualization of, hey, an application comes in, and the computer automatically looks at it and does testing on it, and automatically says, hey, here are the items that you, engineer, need to take a look at because I flagged them because something's not right. And you, engineer, need to take a look at these. Now it becomes much easier to take a look at it because we're plotting it, we're leveraging it on top of a Google map or some other map, and we've got some other information about cities right there. We've got some controls along the left in terms of what we need to look at, the different contours. So we've got some interactive controls. We have even more interactive controls that are very clear, so I can adjust if I want to modify something, if I want to modify the lat long, or I want to modify some other factors, I can easily see the overlap between different items. Very simple visualization, but really saving a lot of work, representing that data down below the screen. I can drill in further if I want to it. I can get closer into that data. I've got terrain. Terrain affects my radio signals. It affects my FM, it affects my AM in really complicated ways. And I'm curious about the population, right? So let's just have this data sitting there. Let's let the engineer turn it on and off as they need, but being able to see that and then being able to go in and look at what's happening with the data. So to kind of sum up here, we're pretty excited about this. This was recently demoed at the National Association of Broadcasters radio conference. Very positive feedback. The industry wants to have the tools too so that they can study what they want to do, prepare their applications before they submit it. But I think that the difference between, the reason I wanted to show this was we often get the really exciting, I think I forgot a couple of slides, which I will. What we're looking at here in many ways is literature. right? We're looking at some of the most beautiful visualizations, just like Moby Dick is great literature. Now, you don't have to write great literature to be able to take advantage of the fact that you are literate and can write a memo. Most of what we do at the office is writing memos and other things like that. So while this is literature, we still need, and we can get real returns of our investment in government by adding simple data visualization memos and other things to our workflow processes. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. Greg, that was a great round out in the sense that you established what I think is a very real diversity among the panel. And yet, and I mean that in the best way, obviously, in that having spoken with you all, each of you produces something that has some very obvious social good that can be used to save money, improve performance, et cetera. And yet it's so diverse in terms of how you're doing it. And frankly, sometimes you need beauty. Other times you need workflow improvement, which is what you're talking about. But
Right.
What an amazing application. And I thank you, as do all taxpayers, for the fact that you probably just saved, I'm guessing, tens of millions of dollars over time.
I think, realistically, there's a calculable figure for this, what we're saving in the and it's not quite that
Beta,
big.
sure.
But I do think if you keep going the next step and you suddenly say, let's put it out there for industry, let them have these interactive tools and data, then it does translate into that. Because instead of taking this long to prepare an application, submit it, and get it reviewed, it becomes condensed like this, and then our cycle of innovation condenses. And industry can do things faster,
Right.
and then we do get into tens of millions or even more of dollars.
Absolutely, and that's not knowable today. We're in
Right.
beta, but yeah, I think I join you in expressing the point of view that if we're really focused on results, which is what we're focused on this panel for sure, if we define insight as something that actually has value, and by the way, it could be cultural value. I'm not suggesting that it's all about making the office better, but if there's something valuable, it doesn't really matter how you did it. But hopefully we did the right thing, the right tool for that use case.
Yeah.
So in any case, I have to ask you to pass me the device. Actually, all I need is the.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Right, and the potential for us to be able to, in that regard, we can't accept this application, here's a problem, but being able to send them a visualization of why this license can't be completed, and here's some tweaks you can make, and I think that's why I like some of the visualizations and the work that Periscopic's doing. Here, let me just slide a lever and see where that is, rather than having to go back to the calculus or go back to other things to do that. Moves the conversation forward. I think that, I guess I want to emphasize that there's an opportunity for us to figure out how to go from the really simple to this really rich stuff. Because right now it's very hard it can be very challenging to sell the rich information into the government, although it has real value. But we're not quite up to that scale, and I think that people need to see, oh, this is what I can do with it as a part of my day-to-day work. This is going to save me hours doing my job.
Do you think that it's possible that because the community that you were empowering with that is largely engineers, and because engineers typically have a very active community for sharing ways of doing things, that its likelihood for getting understood beyond even just the stations and that particular discipline is, hey, here's a way we've done these tremendous reductions that haven't devalued our profession at all, that are actually really frequently probably freeing them up to do something they want to be doing anyway.
Right, so I think that the engineers understand really well the sense of if I made this easier, this frees me up to do other things, and there's other things that they want to do. I think if you've ever seen some software designed by an engineer, there is a little bit of having to show them that there's value in these simple tools. They often believe that their tool is adequate until it gets very, very painful.
Right.
Like the engineers will put up with a lot of pain, more than they need to.
Right.
So, ironically enough, even though I was able to project in the last panel that I spoke on, I'm running into problems. So why don't we just go to Q&A a little bit, and as I migrate my presentation to the device of a colleague, welcome questions. Yeah, I'll probably swap seats with you. Oh, sure, one more try. Sure. I just want to make sure we use every minute to the audience's benefit. Are there any questions that have emerged already that folks are provoked towards? Yes.
We're working on that. I think that what will happen is the plan currently is to make this tool available publicly to industry. And I think the general philosophy around open government and open government data is that we make these tools available publicly, period. That if it's digital, if it's disclosed, it's public. And there's still some cultural issues around making that happen and being patient of it, but the goal is if it's available to industry, yes, it would be available publicly to anybody to use.
Oh, I think that's very significant. In fact, my research is about knowledge production, not just Twitter. And I just gave you the example of Twitter, of how I use Twitter to visualize. I think it's very important to do both. I think that we have to understand the procedural literacy at play. So what I mean by procedural literacy is that we've got a technical filter and we've got a human filter. And we need to understand the way we can analyze through the technical filter and the human filter. I agree that the majority, if you really want to understand the revolution specifically in Egypt, that it's not on Twitter and it's not just on Facebook, but that's just part of it's still an important piece of the puzzle. And I think that we have two camps. We've got these technological determinists, and I'm not one. I'm actually a bibliophile. And there's the other camp that is the people who are really afraid of the fear of the technology overtaking and sort of taking on more credit, and the fear of artificial intelligence. Yes. Yeah. I'm wanting to find that out, and the only way is to go through Twitter collectors who've been data mining the pipe, and there are companies you could go to look for that. But you have to purchase it. Anything above the public you have to purchase it and sort of do that. So I don't know the answer to your question. Yeah, if someone wants to to fund this research, this is where I am right now. I've been really refining this collecting tool because I want to make sure that I am collecting at least a really good sample data of Twitter. Otherwise, this is just really a lot of formal form being done. Someone has a question here. Yes. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure, I'll respond to that.
Okay.
Sure. So the question was about using certain types of visual representations of data, particularly pie graphs and circle charts, and whether they can be misleading in any way, particularly pie charts. Is that fair? So I'm not a big fan of pie charts. I like the concentric circle graph because it actually is representative of the data. That chunk that fits in the middle actually represents the chunk that it takes out of the bigger sample, right? And so it actually means something, right? And so I think it would be an unfair statement to say that there's not always a place for, just because it's a circle doesn't mean it's bad. We like circles, right? Squares, they're okay, but circles are awesome. And so that's, you basically, you just want to make sure that whatever you're visualizing with represents the data. And, the first,
Exactly.
yeah, the first thing that I made was one of my first infographics, the chart of Africa with all the stuff going on. And that was me just experimenting.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
I just wanted to add to that because you were referring to the charts on the Egyptian. I really wanted to show you my process of data exploration, not what I would publish. None of those are publishable data visualizations, in my opinion. I'm trying to explain that I'm just launched this site a few months ago, and I'm just beginning to build the visualization. So that's my practice. That's the practice of exploring through it. I'm using tools that exist. They're not tools I built. I didn't build them. I don't even think they're that attractive. But they're helpful for. For me, I'm interested in having the user be able to reimagine the relationship to technology. You don't have to master technology to be able to get something from it. I think that's what we're all saying here. So I'm really, I'm not a computer scientist. However, going to grab this data and I'm going to put it into a model, and I want to show other people how you could, without being an expert, be able to learn how to read the CSV file, pull it out, and use existing tools just to sort of question and make and sort of defamiliarize yourself with this set. So it's not really a tool for actually publishing and making a claim, not this stuff necessarily, but the whole process together I think is important to understand how does one get to understand the data. That's all.
That was a great question. By the way, I am such a Mac idiot that I need you to literally just open that file.
Yeah, I'd add one quick thing. One of the points, though, I think you're talking in part is using radius in particular, because it feels like the size of a circle is can be tied easily to a single dimension, and it's a tricky thing. It's not like it's always misleading, but it can be. So I definitely agree with both, but definitely, and I think you probably don't disagree with them necessarily either. But right, absolutely, it's definitely a tricky piece of design to work with.
Absolutely. I don't know if you were on the panel or watching the panel that was next door last session about interoperability and standards. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot there. Unfortunately, we're probably going to need to move on, but hopefully we'll have another panel next time about that. You had a question? Yes.
I'd also add to that, if you want to see a good example of like how not to do it and how to do it, with particularly the concentric circle graph, just look at the two different versions of that graphic, because I republished it based on area, and that's the one that I showed. But there's another version based on radius that I heard a lot from the math community about. So
great. So I'm going to take one more question, which is over here, and then I'm going to say a few things that might help string together some of what we've heard, and I want to make sure we still have time for questions after that. So you wanted to say? Tools and libraries, technical innovations.
Yeah.